On a gravel terrace above the Salmon River in western Idaho, a team of archaeologists pulled charcoal samples out of the ground and sent them off for radiocarbon dating, expecting nothing more than a routine confirmation of what they already believed. What came back instead looked like a mistake. The numbers were too old. Not old by a little, but old enough to sit outside everything the discipline had spent 70 years insisting was true. So the lead researcher did what any careful scientist does when a result refuses to make sense. He doubted it, and then he tested it again. New samples were pulled. New hearths were sampled. Different labs ran the material independently, and the dates kept landing in the same impossible place. The lowest occupation layer at a site now known as Cooper's Ferry came back between roughly 15,300 and 16,500 years before the present. People had been living, cooking, and shaping stone on that riverbank more than 3,000 years before the timeline taught in nearly every textbook said anyone could have been there at all. To understand why that number mattered so much, you have to go back to a windswept patch of New Mexico in 1932, where distinctive stone spear points began turning up beside the bones of mammoths and other Ice Age giants near a town called Clovis. The points had a signature nobody could mistake for a natural accident. A long groove struck down the center of each face, a technique that took real skill and a brutal failure rate to pull off. Radiocarbon dating eventually placed these tools at around 13,000 years old, and out of that single data point grew one of the most complete and satisfying explanations in all of archaeology. The account went like this. During the last glaciation, so much of the planet's water was locked into ice that sea levels dropped and a wide land connection emerged where the Bering Strait now separates Siberia from Alaska. People followed migrating animals across that exposed ground and into a continent no human being had ever walked. Two colossal ice sheets, the Laurentide and the Cordilleran, blocked any route further south, sealing the interior shut, until roughly 13 to 14,000 years ago, when a narrow corridor opened between them as the climate warmed. Through that gap poured the ancestors of the Clovis toolmakers, spreading from coast to coast and hunting the great mammals of the Pleistocene into extinction along the way. The dates lined up almost too neatly, and for decades that alignment was treated as proof rather than coincidence. What followed was less like ordinary scientific caution and more like a gatekeeping campaign. Any researcher who proposed evidence of people in the Americas before Clovis ran into ferocious resistance. Their stratigraphy was picked apart, their samples were accused of contamination, and their careers often paid the price. Field workers began referring, half-jokingly and then not so jokingly, to the small circle of prominent skeptics as an enforcement squad, because that is functionally what they had become. Genuine rigor is a service to any field, since most extraordinary claims really do turn out to be wrong. But somewhere along the way, that rigor stopped being applied evenly. Sites that fit the accepted narrative were waved through with modest scrutiny, while sites that threatened it were held to a standard almost nothing could survive. The first real fracture in that wall came from the opposite end of the hemisphere, at a boggy site in southern Chile called Monteverde. A waterlogged peat layer had sealed the location in an oxygen-starved environment that preserved things Stone Age sites almost never keep: wooden stakes still upright, cords of knotted plant fiber, chewed fragments of a medicinal plant, and even what appeared to be a child's footprint beside an ancient hearth. Radiocarbon dating placed the main occupation at roughly 14,500 years ago, more than 1,000 years earlier than Clovis. For years the usual objections were raised, and in 1997 something almost unprecedented happened. A delegation of senior researchers, several of them longtime skeptics, traveled to the site to examine it in person. They walked the layers, studied the material, and went home having changed their minds. Monteverde was accepted as genuine, and the wall that had stood for 7 decades cracked in a way it would never fully repair. That single admission gave permission to a scattering of researchers who had quietly been sitting on strange results of their own. Off the coast of Florida, divers working in a submerged sinkhole recovered stone tools alongside the butchered remains of a mastodon, with cut marks preserved on a tusk. The sealed, undisturbed layer they came from dated to roughly 14,550 years ago, and because it lay beneath water that had protected it from disturbance for millennia, there was no plausible way for younger material to have settled into it. In dry rock shelters in Oregon known as the Paisley Caves, researchers recovered desiccated human waste containing preserved human DNA, dated to around 14,300 years ago. Contamination testing was run exhaustively, and the ancient genetic signal held firm. In central Texas, at a site called Galt, excavators dug beneath a confirmed Clovis layer and kept finding tools in the sediment below it, tools that some estimates pushed back 16 to 20,000 years. Different states, different dating techniques, different classes of physical evidence, and all of it pointed the same direction, backward, into a past the accepted framework had declared impossible. It is against that backdrop that Cooper's Ferry landed with such force. The site sits at the meeting point of Rock Creek and the lower Salmon River, a place the Nez Perce, or Namipu, have long known as the ancient village of Nipihi. For well over a century, Namipu oral tradition held that their people had occupied that land since time out of memory, a claim that mainstream science filed away as cultural heritage rather than empirical fact. Excavations at the site stretch back to the 1960s, but it was a renewed dig led by an Oregon State University archaeologist that produced the numbers strong enough to force a reckoning. The lowest layer of occupation returned a cluster of radiocarbon dates consistently falling between roughly 14,000 and 16,000 years old, with a probabilistic model placing the earliest activity as far back as 16,500 years. The dates weren't a single anomalous reading from one ambiguous sample. They came from charcoal recovered across multiple hearths, stacked in a sequence that made geological sense, older material sealed beneath younger material, exactly as undisturbed sediment should behave. Set that number against a map of the ice sheets and the old account doesn't just look outdated, it becomes physically unworkable. 16,000 years ago, the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets were still fused together, and the inland corridor that Clovis-first migration depended on would not open for another 1 to 2,000 years. People were already living well south of a barrier the reigning model insisted hadn't been breached yet. The tools recovered from those deep layers reinforce the point. They aren't fluted Clovis points at all, but a different kind of blade with a narrowed, stemmed base, shaped for a different method of hafting entirely, an approach archaeologists call the Western stem tradition. If Clovis technology had truly spread outward from a single founding migration, you would expect it to sit beneath everything else as the ancestral form. Instead, in the Pacific Northwest, an entirely separate tool-making tradition occupies the older ground. The lead researcher published the initial findings in the journal Science in the summer of 2019, and a follow-up analysis a few years later in Science Advances refined the chronology further, tightening the dating and closing off avenues that might have let skeptics dismiss the result as a fluke. Some scholars have also pointed to intriguing similarities between these stem points and much older examples recovered in Hokkaido, Japan, lending support to a theory that the earliest arrivals may have moved down the Pacific coastline by boat rather than walking through any interior corridor at all, following a resource-rich coastal route sometimes nicknamed the Kelp Highway. It remains an active area of research rather than settled fact, but it fits comfortably alongside everything else the ground has been revealing. And Cooper's Ferry, remarkable as it is, wasn't even the oldest evidence to surface. In the gypsum flats of White Sands, New Mexico, researchers uncovered layer upon layer of fossilized human footprints pressed into what had once been the shore of a shallow lake. Some were the broad prints of adults, others small enough to belong to children, with stride patterns that in places suggested a child breaking into a run. There is no ambiguity to interpret in a footprint the way there sometimes is with a chipped stone. A track left by a walking human being doesn't require an argument about whether nature might have produced it by accident. Using seeds from an aquatic plant found in the layers directly above and below the prints, researchers dated them to somewhere between roughly 21 and 23,000 years ago, a period sitting deep within the coldest stretch of the last glacial maximum, long before any inland route south had even begun to open. Critics raised a legitimate concern that the seed species might absorb old carbon from the water it grew in, artificially inflating the age. In response, the research team returned and dated the same layers using two entirely independent methods, ancient pollen from land plants and luminescence dating, which measures how long buried mineral grains have been shielded from sunlight. All three approaches converged on the same window of time, and the footprints held. Taken together, these discoveries don't describe a minor correction to an otherwise sound framework. They describe the collapse of one and the emergence of something far messier and more interesting in its place. The Clovis-first model isn't a fringe position that a handful of dissenters reject anymore. It is the settled understanding within the field that the toolmakers at Blackwater Draw were latecomers rather than pioneers, arriving on a continent that other people had already been living on for thousands of years. Some of the sites behind that shift, like Monteverde and Cooper's Ferry, are now essentially uncontested. Others sit further out on the timeline and remain the subject of exactly the kind of rigorous argument that good science is supposed to produce. That ongoing disagreement isn't evidence of suppression. It's the field functioning the way it's meant to, testing extraordinary claims against extraordinary evidence until only the strongest survive. Perhaps the most striking thread running through all of it is how long the Namipu had been saying precisely what the radiocarbon dates would eventually confirm. Their account of having occupied that stretch of river since time immemorial was treated for generations as a separate, lesser category of knowledge, respected in passing but kept apart from the hard numbers produced in a laboratory. When those numbers finally arrived, they landed exactly where the oral tradition had pointed all along. A way of knowing that had been quietly dismissed turned out to be carrying an accurate record across dozens of generations, one that formal science needed the better part of a century to catch up to. There are practical consequences to all of this beyond the satisfaction of getting the dates right. Museum exhibits built around a single triumphant arrival 13,000 years ago now need to be rewritten to reflect multiple waves of people, moving by different routes, carrying different tool-making traditions, and likely speaking different languages entirely. Genetic studies of living indigenous populations and ancient remains are being revisited in light of these older dates, since a population that arrived by sea 16,000 years ago or more would have had far more time to diversify, split into distinct groups, and develop the deep genetic and cultural variation observed across the Americas today than a single corridor migration 13,000 years ago could ever account for. It also reshapes how researchers think about the earliest economies of the continent, since people living south of the ice sheets millennia before Clovis would have had to adapt to environments, plants, and animals that the old model never gave them time to encounter. The question of when people first reached the Americas, and by what route, is no longer a closed chapter with a single accepted answer. It's an active, unsettled field, with new excavations underway right now that could push the timeline back again before this year is finished. Was it a slow migration down the Pacific coastline by boat, a movement predating even the White Sands footprints, or a path nobody has proposed yet because the physical evidence for it simply hasn't surfaced? The ground keeps offering up new answers faster than anyone can update the textbooks, and every one of them seems to point further back than the last.